When most people hear Sun Tzu, they think of battlefields, generals, and motivational quotes shared on LinkedIn by people who've never actually read him. But the real truth is far more unsettling. Sun Tzu wasn't interested in winning wars. He was interested in avoiding them. Not victory, cost. And today, 2,500 years later, the world's most powerful nations are still falling into the exact same economic trap he warned about. Because here's what Sun Tzu understood. It's not the enemy army that destroys a state. It's the bill that comes after the war. People think the art of war is about fighting. It's actually about finance. And once you understand that, history starts to look completely different. You can't understand Sun Tzu without understanding the world he lived in. The 6th and 5th centuries BCE. China is fractured into kingdoms, trying to annihilate each other. Every kingdom believes it can unite the world. And they're all burning through their treasuries to try. War is constant. Alliances form and collapse. Armies grow every decade. They're transitioning from aristocratic chariot warfare to mass infantry mobilizations. And that means food, metal, supply chains, taxes, on a scale no previous generation could have imagined. States aren't just fighting wars, they're stress testing their economies. When a king sends an army to war, he's taking out a loan against his future. And far too often, that loan can't be repaid. Western audiences romanticize ancient warfare as tactical and heroic. But in this period, war was logistics before anything else. The moment an army moved, the meter started running. You needed wagons, grain, horses, craftsmen, armorers, cooks, blacksmiths, porters. All of them had to be paid or fed. A campaign lasting more than a few months could bankrupt a small state. One lasting more than a year could collapse a larger one. And because these kingdoms were trapped in a cycle of insecurity, they kept fighting anyway. It was an arms race before the modern world invented the term. And it was pushing the entire political system to the breaking point. This is the world Sun Tzu walked into. Not as a philosopher sitting quietly in a corner, but as a strategist forced to solve an economic crisis disguised as a military one. In the West, we romanticize him as some ancient CEO whisperer. But in reality, he was closer to a risk manager. He looked at the numbers, the costs, the timelines, the logistics, and realized that the way states were conducting war was unsustainable. Victory meant nothing if the treasury collapsed. And many rulers never understood that. They believed the enemy army was the greatest threat. Sun Tzu believed their own spending was the threat. That's why the most important line in the art of war comes right at the beginning, before he ever talks about deception, terrain, or morale. He says war is of vital importance to the state. Not glorious, not honorable. Vital, meaning dangerous, disruptive, and capable of destroying the very society it claims to defend. He spends the rest of the book explaining how to keep war contained, controlled, and as cheap as possible. And he does it in a way that reveals his obsession with minimizing financial risk. Even his most famous ideas are actually disguised economic principles. When he says, the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting, that's not mysticism, that's cost avoidance. It's the ancient equivalent of getting the outcome you want without burning capital. When he warns that no nation has ever benefited from prolonged warfare, he's stating a literal fiscal truth. The longer a campaign drags on, the more it erodes the state's capacity to function. His emphasis on speed, efficiency, intelligence gathering, and psychological pressure comes from the same place. Because these tools are cheaper than armies. Sun Tzu wasn't trying to win battles. He was trying to prevent states from going bankrupt while trying to win battles. To understand how revolutionary this thinking was, you need to understand what Chinese warfare looked like before him. For centuries, aristocratic elites fought ritualized conflicts where honor mattered more than outcomes, and economic cost barely entered the discussion. But as populations grew and weapons changed, warfare scaled up into something unrecognizable. States began minting coins, reforming tax systems, and building bureaucracies just to sustain their armies. War became a national project and an existential financial risk. Sun Tzu saw that the old mindset had become suicidal. War could no longer be treated as a stage for noble gestures or symbolic victories. It had become a budget threat that required cold, unsentimental analysis. This is why Sun Tzu is such an anomaly in world history. While most military thinkers glorified combat, He treated war as a balance sheet. He calculated supply chains, resource depletion, and opportunity cost centuries before those terms existed. He had no patience for generals who chased glory at the expense of stability, because he understood a truth that modern leaders often forget. Every decision on the battlefield is a decision about national solvency. And if you miscalculate, you don't just lose soldiers, you lose the state. When you look at the art of war through this economic lens, the book stops sounding like ancient poetry and starts sounding like a spreadsheet. Sun Tzu opens his treatise by listing the 5 fundamental factors that determine the outcome of war. And buried beneath the philosophical language is a simple truth. These are cost variables. The moral law, heaven, earth, the commander, method and discipline, these aren't mystical categories. They're resource management categories. He's asking, what does this war require? How stable is your state? How resilient are your people? How efficiently can you move? How disciplined is your administration? He's performing a risk assessment long before that phrase existed. And from the very first page, Sun Tzu makes it clear. Leaders who cannot calculate cost have no business calculating strategy. That's why so much of the book is about logistics rather than heroics. Sun Tzu devotes an entire section to the economics of feeding an army, and the logic is brutal. When your army is 20 miles from home, you lose the price of 100 measures of grain. His point is obvious. Distance increases cost, and prolonged distance multiplies it. He explains that transporting supplies drains the treasury faster than paying troops, that maintaining an army in the field collapses the agricultural labor base, and that wasteful commanders bankrupt their nations while winning meaningless skirmishes. For a military treatise, it's weirdly uninterested in battle and obsessively interested in how much the battle costs. He advises rulers to use the enemy's resources whenever possible, not as a tactical convenience, but as a fiscal necessity. He scolds leaders who prolong campaigns, not because they're indecisive, but because they're financially reckless. Sun Tzu understood something modern states often forget. Logistics don't support strategy. Logistics are strategy. His approach to intelligence reveals the same financial logic. Today, when governments debate surveillance budgets or intelligence agencies ask for funding, the discussion is framed in terms of security, ethics, or national interest. Sun Tzu framed it in terms of cost efficiency. A single spy, he explains, can prevent an entire army from marching in the wrong direction. A single intercepted message can save a nation millions. He writes that, what enables the wise sovereign and the good general to strike and conquer and achieve things beyond the reach of ordinary men is foreknowledge, not courage or force. Foreknowledge is simply the ancient world's word for data. Sun Tzu saw information not as an accessory to warfare, but as the cheapest and most effective weapon available. He was the first strategist to understand that misallocation of information is misallocation of capital. Even his emphasis on speed is fundamentally about economics. Speed is the essence of war, he writes, and most readers interpret this as a call for aggressive action. But Sun Tzu's real meaning is subtler. Speed lowers cost. When he urges commanders to move swiftly where the enemy does not expect you, he's describing a cost-benefit trick, using timing and deception to avoid the expenses of direct conflict. Every day an army spends marching, feeding, and waiting increases financial exposure. Victory delayed is money burned. Victory won through maneuver instead of attrition preserves resources. You realize now that Sun Tzu's famous preference for flexibility, adaptability, and psychological advantage isn't philosophical flair. It's fiscal discipline. But his deepest financial insight is woven into the structure of the book itself. Every line is about opportunity cost. Every choice a ruler makes closes the door to a cheaper choice. Sun Tzu isn't against war. He's against waste. And the ultimate waste, in his view, is fighting battles you didn't have to fight. That's why he praises generals who break resistance without bloodshed, who win through diplomacy, intimidation, deception, or alliances. To Sun Tzu, these aren't secondary strategies. They're primary strategies, because they conserve the state's limited capital. In one of his most revealing passages, he warns that rulers who enjoy warfare for its own sake will bring ruin upon their kingdoms. Behind the poetic language lies a cold accounting principle. If you treat war like a passion instead of a liability, you will eventually default. What makes Sun Tzu's financial genius even clearer is how states around him succeeded or collapsed based on whether they listened to him. Some kingdoms poured their wealth into drawn-out sieges that drained their tax base and left them vulnerable to internal rebellion. Others applied Sun Tzu's logic, using information, alliances, and rapid strikes to avoid the economic spiral of prolonged conflict. States that recognized war as a financial instrument, something to be wielded sparingly and strategically, survived longer. Those that treated war as a test of honor or brute strength burned out. Sun Tzu wasn't just right in theory. History proved him right in practice. And this is where the story turns from ancient analysis to something far more contemporary. Because the uncomfortable truth is that Sun Tzu's warnings have echoed through every major conflict of the last 2 centuries. Modern governments still make the same mistake he tried to prevent. They enter wars without calculating the long-term economic strain, and then they watch their budgets fracture. The Soviet Union in Afghanistan, the United States in Vietnam, imperial powers in World War I. These conflicts weren't lost because armies were weak. They were lost because the economic model behind them collapsed. Sun Tzu would have recognized the pattern instantly. Prolonged warfare erodes the state faster than the enemy ever could. Meanwhile, the tools he championed, intelligence, deception, targeted operations, rapid maneuvering, have become the backbone of modern strategy, precisely because they're cheaper. Cyber warfare is Sun Tzu. Sanctions are Sun Tzu. Proxy wars, covert influence operations, strategic deterrence, all of them aim to achieve maximum effect with minimal financial exposure. The world's most powerful states, whether they acknowledge it or not, still live inside Sun Tzu's balance sheet. But the clearest modern example of his influence is in how nations now think about the concept of national power itself. Sun Tzu believed that a state's strength came not just from its army, but from its economic resilience, its ability to absorb shocks, recover, and continue functioning. He wrote in an era when kingdoms crumbled because they overspent on campaigns they couldn't sustain. We live in a world where great powers face the same dilemma in different clothing. Military budgets, debt burdens, resource dependencies, supply chain fragility, and the long-term cost of projecting force. Sun Tzu might not recognize the technology, but he would recognize the math. The deeper lesson, the one most people miss, is that Sun Tzu wasn't teaching rulers how to win wars. He was teaching them how to avoid national bankruptcy. His true genius was understanding that the cost of conflict outlives the conflict itself. States don't fail because they lose battles. They fail because they drain the capital that keeps them coherent, confident, and functional. In Sun Tzu's world, victory is irrelevant if the treasury collapses afterward. The best war is the one that doesn't require repairing your economy when it's over. And that's the lens through which the art of war suddenly becomes something entirely different. It's not a book about boldness or aggression. It's a book about restraint. It's not about overpowering opponents. It's about outlasting them. Sun Tzu doesn't glorify triumph. He glorifies stability. To him, the ruler who preserves resources is wiser than the ruler who conquers cities. The general who wins without fighting is wiser than the general who destroys armies. And the state that knows when not to act is stronger than the one that acts out of pride. Sun Tzu's philosophy is not the philosophy of a warrior. It is the philosophy of a steward, someone responsible for maintaining the long-term solvency of the nation. In the end, Sun Tzu's financial genius lies in his refusal to separate economics from power. He understood that the two are inseparable, that war is merely the most expensive policy decision a state can make, and that the ruler who miscalculates its cost signs his own death warrant. His message is simple, unsettling, and eternally relevant. Strength is not measured by how hard you strike, but by how much you can afford to strike. And history shows that when financial systems collide, it is not the bravest nation that prevails. It is the most economically disciplined. History doesn't repeat itself, but if you don't understand it, it'll cost you all the same. And if this gave you a new perspective, we're here. History provides the answers. You just need to know how to listen.